Each year on the second Sunday of Easter, 1 week after we've had our great high feast, we hear the story, as John tells it, of Jesus' first appearance to his disciples after his resurrection. The first time the risen Jesus appears to his disciples, he comes among them and says, "Peace be with you." He shows them his hands and his side. They see that it is really him, and they rejoice. But one of the disciples, Thomas, the one who often gets called the doubter, wasn't with the others that night for some reason. He didn't get to see what the others had seen. They'd told him, of course, but Thomas couldn't fully internalize what he had heard from the others. He tells them, "Unless I see with my own eyes and touch his wounds with my own hands, I will not believe." 8 days later, the Gospel of John tells us Jesus appears a second time to the disciples as they hide away from the authorities behind locked doors. But this time, Thomas is with them. Jesus shows Thomas his wounds. He invites him to come and see for himself. "Put your finger here and see my hands. Put your hand in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Thomas responds to Jesus with this declaration of faith: "My Lord and my God." Often in the history of the church, this story has been told as a cautionary tale. Don't be like Thomas, who demanded proof in order to believe. Just believe. Your faith is stronger and better if you don't need proof. Just believe. But I think many in the church have come to realize that this reading of the story is overly simplistic, and it misses the compassion with which Jesus actually responds to his skeptical friend Thomas. The fact is, most people don't come into a relationship of genuine faith in Jesus without the benefit of personal experience. Experience that makes personal the power of Jesus' life and death and resurrection. For most of us, it isn't enough that we've heard the story told. Resurrection is that spectacular and miraculous and unbelievable. It isn't easy to really believe it. In the story of Thomas, Jesus acknowledges our very human need to be shown, sometimes repeatedly, in order to overcome our anxiety, our uncertainty, our reluctance, even our doubt. He approaches Thomas like a loving friend, a loving parent even, coaxing an inexperienced child to see and to understand something that's new to him, something very important for him to learn. Doubt is not a sin, or if it is, Jesus didn't punish Thomas for it. Rather, he came back for him, this one who was left out the first time around, to help him in his unbelief. Jesus didn't shrug his shoulders and dismiss him as hopeless. He came back and offered what Thomas said he needed in order to believe, to be able to see the wounds on Jesus' hands and to touch his side. I've always loved this story of Thomas. Sure, it's true what Jesus says at the end of the story. Blessed are those who simply hear the good news and believe. Not just hear, but hear. But I haven't met very many of those people. Have you? Most of us hear the story, maybe as children for the first time, and it's a hope-filled story. It's a beautiful story, but it doesn't feel real to us right away. Not until we've experienced loss and grief and sacrifice, and yet experienced new life in the midst of it and on the other side of it. The way Jesus responds to Thomas with such loving kindness, such willing compassion to help him along the way, that to me is the bigger takeaway from this beautiful story for the second Sunday of Easter. The disciples were all in a state of shock and grief that first Easter morning. As John tells it, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb. She saw, but didn't understand what she saw. She thought Jesus' body had been taken away. That morning, two other disciples went to the tomb, but they didn't understand either. Not really. Not until that night when the risen Christ appeared to them and spoke to them and showed them his risen body, living but scarred. Thomas isn't especially weak. In fact, not much different than the rest of the disciples. At first, they didn't really understand what Mary Magdalene had told them either. In the midst of their grief and shock, they all needed to be helped to believe. Like Thomas and the other disciples, our whole world is in a state of shock and grief right now. If not over the loss of life, then over the loss of perceived safety, the loss of work and stability, the loss of social interaction, of normalcy, the loss of confidence in our healthcare system to handle a crisis like this, of our systems of government to handle it, or some of our citizens to handle it. And none of us knows how long this will endure or how bad it may get. Many people have lived with this kind of insecurity and fear and grief all their lives, as they've never had a safety net that isn't full of holes a mile wide. Farm workers from Mexico and Central America, refugees fleeing war in Syria and Yemen and Sudan, kids in foster care. Others are feeling fear at this kind of existential level for the first time in our lives. In the midst of this self-imposed isolation, we shouldn't be surprised if we're not sleeping well, if a kind of dread creeps up in our imaginations on a regular basis, or if we feel listless occasionally, agitated, unhappy. We should not be surprised if our confidence is shaken. These are times that will shake us to our core. But we should also remember this from these first Easter stories. We have a God who does not make us find our way back to faith on our own. Our God is undeterred by locked doors, whether they are of the physical variety or of the spiritual. So let us pray with all the confidence we can muster. Lord, I believe, and Lord, help my unbelief. Amen.